Hello, I'm Geraint Vincent. Welcome to Talking Politics. Carl and Shehab are with me today to discuss how Donald Trump's stunning victory will have gone down in Downing Street. Plus, Kemi Badenoch steps up for her first Prime Minister's questions. So how did she do? Carl Dinnen is here with me in the studio and Shehab Khan is in Westminster for us. Let's start with the election of Donald Trump. Carl, we've had a statement from the Prime Minister today congratulating the new president-elect. Let me just read a section of that. As the closest of allies, says Mr Starmer, we stand shoulder to shoulder in defence of our shared values of freedom, democracy and enterprise. From growth and security to innovation and tech, I know that the UK-US special relationship will continue to prosper on both sides of the Atlantic for years to come. Well, Carl, Mr Starmer fulfilling the first foreign policy duty of any British Prime Minister, which is to use the phrase special relationship as often as possible. Where is the special relationship today, do you think?
Well, on one hand, it looks quite tricky. Actually, on both hands, it looks quite tricky. On the one hand, because both Keir Starmer and David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, have said pretty disobliging things about Donald Trump. I mean, David Lammy called him a tyrant in a toupee. And also said he was not only a woman-hating neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath, but also a profound threat to the international order. So, you know, that's a diplomatic road bump, perhaps. That said, both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary did go out of their way to build relationships with Team Trump before the election. The Prime Minister was one of the first world leaders to phone Donald Trump after the assassination attempt. David Lammy actually has a very good relationship going back some years with the Vice President nominee, J.D. Vance. So it's not quite as clear-cut as they've been rude about him in the past. Some people are suggesting that maybe David Lammy can't stay in his position now because of the things that he said. I mean, that is one way of looking at it, especially as his position is perceived as being weak by some in Westminster. The other way of looking at it is, well, hang on, the Prime Minister can't be seen to change his Foreign Secretary because it doesn't suit the man in the White House. So there are definitely two sides to that. The other thing of substance that I think is important to say is what Donald Trump does is going to be very important. Whether he introduces the tariffs that he's going to say and creates, you know, possibly, you know, some sort of world trade war, and what he does about Ukraine will be absolutely crucial.
Shehab, before I get your thoughts on this, I just want to play an exchange that our US correspondent Dan Rivers had with Donald Trump Jr. last week. Have a listen to this.
The British Labour Party accused of interfering in this election. Will that damage the special relationship?
It's certainly not a great start because it's clear what they're doing, and it's absolute lunacy what I see going on in the UK right now when they're jailing people for misgendering someone. I mean, it's honestly, it's disgusting, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
It was unfortunate, wasn't it, Shehab, the timing of that, the visit by Labour Party people out to join in with the Kamala Harris campaign. What conversations do you think are being had in Downing Street today?
Yeah, as Carl said, as road bumps go, that was quite a significant one. The fact there was a social media post from a member of staff of the Labour Party saying that they had spaces available to go to the United States for former or current Labour Party staff members or Labour members to go and campaign for Kamala Harris. At the time, Keir Starmer was adamant that this wasn't something that was being centrally organised by the Labour Party, had nothing to do with him. He said it was quite normal practice for people in their spare time to go campaign for whichever party they saw fit. Of course, the Democrats are politically the sister party of the Labour Party, but the fact that the Trump campaign not only picked up on it, but actually put in a formal complaint is a worry, and I've spoken to a number of people within government who've said that the reason why this is such a concern is because they're aware that the Trump administration, and Donald Trump in particular, is the type of politician that can hold a grudge, that he won't forget about this. It's something that could come up in the future. But work has been going on for quite some time to build relationships with the Republicans from even before that moment. We saw when Keir Starmer was out in the US, he had that dinner with Donald Trump, where the two spoke. We've seen that the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, who, as Carl mentioned, has got a bit of a history of posting things about Donald Trump on his social media that aren't exactly the most flattering. Well, he's been in the US a fair bit, and he's been meeting with J.D. Vance. He's been talking to a number of senior Republicans in Washington to try and build those relationships. Mr Lammy himself has been saying he's actually got quite a lot in common with JD Vance. He thinks there's someone that they can work together. In Downing Street, the only thing they'll be talking about from this moment onwards is how can they build a relationship with the Trump administration that puts all those things to aside. They can move past the so-called claim of election interference. They can move past the comments that have been made previously. Remember, JD Vance himself had been critical of Donald Trump in the past. So it's clear that you can rebuild a relationship there, because ultimately the relationship between the UK and the US is so important when it comes to a number of foreign policy issues, and Keir Starmer will know he needs to work with Donald Trump if he's going to be an effective world leader.
I should just add as well that, contrary to what Donald Trump Jr. was saying in that clip, no one, as far as we're aware, in the UK has been jailed for misgendering anyone. Before we go over to the chamber, I just want to quickly discuss Kemi Badenoch's debut. Carl, some people thrive at the dispatch box, some people crumble. What's your feeling for how the new Tory party leader is going to get on?
Well, I mean, it's a big moment whenever a new leader steps forward to the dispatch box on either side, and it's often something that, you know, goes down in history as their first big moment. She is a combative performer. You would expect her to be one of the ones that thrives. You know, this is the arena where many people think she can do very well, particularly against Keir Starmer, who isn't as forthright a speaker and, you know, perhaps isn't as good a communicator as she is. So it will be fascinating to see how they start lining up against each other, you know, going head to head, because it will set the tone for these confrontations for years probably to come, and possibly into the next election.
Yeah, this is what our politics are going to look like for the next 4 or 5 years. Shehab, what are you looking forward to from today's session?
Look, this is going to be a very different experience for Keir Starmer. He's got a lot of experience at PMQs because he's been leader of the opposition and now Prime Minister. But this is different because as leader of the opposition, he was asking the questions and it was different Prime Ministers answering them. As Prime Minister, he's been facing a Rishi Sunak who lost an election, who's been taking a slightly different approach because fundamentally he's no longer the Prime Minister. It's a very different attitude to the one that Kemi Badenoch is going to have. As Carl says, she's very combative. She's going to be taking a very different tone to Rishi Sunak. And this is going to be the first time that Keir Starmer is really put under pressure in that combative sort of way at PMQs, because he's not faced that before. So it's going to be a challenge for him. But it's also going to be a challenge for Kemi Badenoch. It's her first time doing this. It's not easy stepping up to the dispatch box when you know there is a lot of pressure riding on it, when everyone in Westminster thinks this is where you should excel. So all eyes are going to be on Kemi Badenoch to see what questions she asks and how she delivers them.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Expectations are high for her performance on her side, and that's not an easy place to be starting from.
I just want to touch quickly on the business of being an opposition, Carl, because the Tories have so few MPs. In the appointments that she's made this week, Carl, Kemi Badenoch has been somewhat restricted in the kind of amount of opposition that she can supply, just because it's a numbers game. I think Mr Starmer's appointed 124 government posts, has he? I mean, the Tories just can't match that because they don't have enough MPs.
No, I mean, it is the main front benchers that are the key people. You know, the shadow minister for paper clips isn't someone that often gets much attention anyway, to be perfectly honest with you. So it is the shadow team, which she has tried to some extent to make quite broad and to include people who were willing to serve with her, who were not, I mean, Robert Jenrick, obviously, people who were not on her side during the leadership. Others like Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly decided that they didn't want to be on her front bench. So she is trying, it seems, to bring the party together. Some interesting, eye-catching appointments, I think you could say, with Chris Philp in the Shadow Home Office role and Priti Patel in the Shadow Foreign Office role. We'll see how they do.
It was Kemi Badenoch's first appearance at Prime Minister's Questions. Let's have a listen to some of the key exchanges in round one of Kemi versus Keir.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by congratulating President-elect Trump on his historic election victory. As the closest of allies, the UK and US will continue to work together to protect our shared values of freedom and democracy. And having had dinner with President-elect Trump just a few weeks ago, I look forward to working with him in the years to come. May I also welcome the Leader of the Opposition to her place, my fourth Tory leader in 4.5 years. But I do look forward to working with her in the interests of the British public.
The Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch! Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his almost warm welcome? And can I also echo the comments that he has made? It is an immense privilege and the honour of my life. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary met him in September. Did the Foreign Secretary take that opportunity to apologise for making derogatory and scatological references, including, and I quote, Trump is not only a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath, he is also a profound threat to the international order. And if he did not apologise, will the Prime Minister do so now on his behalf?
The Foreign Secretary and I did meet President-elect Trump just a few weeks ago for dinner for about a couple of hours, and we discussed a number of issues of global significance. It was a very constructive exercise.
I'm very sure that President Trump will soon be calling to thank him for sending all of those North London Labour activists to campaign for his opponent. Given that most of his cabinet signed a motion to ban President Trump from addressing Parliament, will the Prime Minister show that he and his government can be more than student politicians by asking you, Mr. Speaker, to extend an invitation to President Trump to address Parliament on his next visit?
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is giving a masterclass on student politics. Seriously, Mr. Speaker, we live in probably a more volatile world than we've lived in for many decades. It is absolutely crucial that we have a strong relationship, that strong special relationship forged in difficult circumstances between the US and the UK. We will continue to work, as we have done in the 4 months in government, on issues of security, our economy and global conflict.
His scripted lines are showing that he has not even listened to the budget himself. So I will try a different question. Perhaps he can give something that is unscripted to the people watching. Farmers across the United Kingdom... Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr.
Order!
If she's going to complain about scripted answers, it's probably best not to read that from a script.
Well, Carl, I don't know about you, but what shone out to me right from the start in that PMQs was Kemi Badenoch's smile. I mean, she's clearly delighted to be there, clearly enjoying herself. What did you make of her debut?
And I thought she did very well. She understood the assignment. She asked him a series of unanswerable questions. Will he apologise for what the Foreign Secretary said about the US President-elect? Will he invite Donald Trump to Parliament? Will he start free trade negotiations? When will he raise defence spending? All things that the Prime Minister, of course, couldn't answer or wouldn't want to answer there and then. And the Prime Minister replying with, the big picture, strategic stuff about fixing the foundation, serious stuff about talking to Donald Trump about national security and the economy. And that made him look evasive. And I thought she also delivered it all very well, very calmly, quite quietly. I mean, we may get fireworks in the months and years to come, but none today. I thought she did really well for her first go.
Yeah, Shehab, what was the quote you mentioned at the start that Mrs. Badenoch suggested that the government apologise for Donald Trump as a neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath? What did you make of Mrs. Badenoch's opening attack lines?
Yeah, we know this is uncomfortable territory for Keir Starmer and his Foreign Secretary David Lammy, so it's no surprise that she decided, especially when there's been such a big, significant world event and the US presidency has been decided, that that's what she decided to try and pin Keir Starmer down on. As Carl said, she asked a series of questions that are almost impossible for the Prime Minister to answer, which is why he was quite evasive. She also called him out on scripted answers, which I thought was very apt for her to do. But I think the big thing here is that day one was always going to be difficult, but she enjoys the fact that there's a lot of MPs there today supporting her because it's her first appearance. She also gets the added bonus of the fact that Donald Trump has won the presidency literally just a few hours ago, so there's a lot for her to go in on. The question will be whether or not Kemi Badenoch can keep up this sort of momentum, whether her performances will be like this moving forward. It's easy to do this on a day like today where there's a lot of excitement around Westminster, but to sort of coin a phrase which is often used in football, will she be able to deliver on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of March, for example, where there's not as much excitement around Westminster, where there's not as much news? Is she going to be the same Kemi Badenoch we saw today? That's going to define her performances as Leader of the Opposition.
I thought it was quite clever nonetheless, though, Shehab, the way she used the kind of template of what happened in America overnight to structure her questions to Mr. Starmer. I'm thinking particularly of, attacking the budget on the basis as that it was pure Bidenomics, which of course has failed the electoral test in America.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to start listing off and criticising former leaders of the opposition, but one of the things that had happened in previous years gone by is that there would be major world events or major news stories that would be developing, and sometimes leaders of the opposition would come in and ask questions on a completely different topic, something else that they thought was necessary, and often people watching would be slightly confused. You'd have a week where housing was the big story, and for some bizarre reason there'd be questions about immigration being asked. Kemi Badenoch coming in and actually focusing on what is the big news stories of the day, Donald Trump's election, but also focusing on the budget, which we've just had last week, suggests that she's going to try and keep it topical, keep it on the issues that actually matter and the ones that are in the news at the moment, which, again, should be a fruitful strategy. But like I said, this all depends on how it goes. This is only her first appearance of PMQs. She's potentially got several years ahead of her if she stays in the role and Keir Starmer stays in the role.
And we saw a bit, Carl, of that combative approach that we were talking about at the start. I thought in some of Mrs. Badenoch's responses when she dismissed Mr. Starmer's answers, discuss, chat, she said at one point.
Yeah, she's good at communicating.
It's a very colloquial
she
way.
She thinks on her feet. Yeah, she's got a very punchy style, which, as I was saying before, Keir Starmer cannot match. That is just not his style. He's much more serious and slightly more verbose. And I think PMQs rewards the punchier style, frankly, because, when you're talking around an issue at greater length, you can start to look evasive. When you are being evasive, it points it up. It makes it more obvious that that's what you're doing. I think Labour were rattled. One thing that it's hard to tell when you're not in the chamber how much noise is actually going on because, the way TV and radio works, it dampens down the amount of noise, the shouting from the back benches. But you could see in the number of times that the speaker had to stop things to tell people to calm down and quieten down, that there was a lot of noise coming from the Labour benches. And I got the sense that they were quite rattled and they were trying to shout her down.
Shehab, what did you... there was, of course, also a challenge for the Prime Minister today to kind of deal with a new leader of the opposition who was really going to come after him. What did you make of how Mr. Starmer responded?
As I sort of mentioned just before we went into watching PMQs, this is a whole new experience for him. His time at PMQs so far, from leader of the opposition into Prime Minister, has been very different. And now there will be a huge tonal shift in terms of what he faces from the opposite side. A more combative leader of the opposition, potentially asking slightly tougher questions, potentially coming back with quite quick remarks and trying to point out the fact that he's not answering questions in a way that he didn't have to face when he was leader of the opposition himself, and in a way he didn't have to face when Rishi Sunak was opposite him as leader of the opposition. For the Prime Minister, these are questions that are very, very difficult for him to answer because right now his number one priority is going to be dealing with a special relationship. Donald Trump has just been elected in the US and he will not want to say anything at all in the House of Commons today that could potentially jeopardise what is already proving to be quite a difficult relationship given what we've seen in the last couple of months and what his Foreign Secretary had been posting on Twitter/X for quite some time. So today he had to be very careful in how he answered. That's why there was so much pivoting towards the budget at almost every opportunity. He wanted to talk about fixing the foundations, that line that Kemi Badenoch says was scripted, because that's more comfortable territory. Right. When she's asking questions about the US, he knows he can't answer, which is why it was difficult, but he probably did what he had to do as Prime Minister to make sure that he can have a smoother relationship with Trump moving forward.
Yeah, and Mr. Starmer, Carl's occasionally been criticised in the past at PMQs for perhaps not being able to think on his feet as quickly as he might do. I thought in some of his responses today, particularly in making the crack about Mrs. Badenoch criticising from reading from a script while reading from a script, that showed he was kind of up for the fight as well.
Yeah, he didn't do too badly with some of those ad-libs. It was quite funny. I was very struck by how she stood up and the first thing she said was she wanted to be a constructive leader of the opposition, which they absolutely, without fail, all do. And then within 2 minutes, it descended into the normal Punch and Judy between them. I thought, actually, one thing we haven't talked about was the points that Ed Davey raised, which are, now he raised the substance of the potential issues that between this country and a Trump-led United States. The possibility of a trade war, which would be, let's face it, would be disastrous given, not only given the state of our public finances, but given the budget that we've just had, where a lot of money, a lot of tax has been raised, and a lot of money is already being spent, raising the possibility that, inflation could go up, interest rates could go up. They're things that could happen more if there is a trade war with the United States, and if we are caught and having to choose between looking towards America and looking towards Europe, as Ed Davey said. And then the other thing was, of course, Trump's attitude towards Ukraine. I mean, Trump has been very soft on Putin. As Ed Davey said, he called the Ukraine invasion, Trump called it genius. Now, he has said that he will solve it on day one, and it is widely thought the only way you solve it quickly is by telling the Ukrainians that they've got to settle for giving up some of their territory. Now, unless Europe is going to go along with that, which people in Europe will find very, very hard to do, Europe is going to have to find the armaments and the funding to support Ukraine. It is going to be a very, very big ask for us to do that.
And, this Prime Minister began the session began the day paying tribute to the special relationship. But that's going to come under a real test, as you say, on Ukraine, because first time, certainly that I can remember, maybe the first time since Suez, when there's been a real big difference, or there will be a real big difference in terms of foreign policy between the US and UK governments. Perhaps the Falklands is slightly different.
Potentially. I mean, a lot of this hinges on whether Trump does what he says he will do. And it can be very hard to tell with Donald Trump. I mean, we all thought in his first term that NATO was at risk. And in many ways, he forced many of the countries in NATO to raise their defence spending, and you could argue that in some ways NATO was stronger at the end of it. And he would probably say, well, that was always my negotiating strategy from the start. It's hard to know with him what he really means and what he's really going to do. And also, frankly, the United States have a lot of big domestic challenges. Is Ukraine going to be as high up the agenda for him as he seemed to indicate by saying he would solve it on day one? Don't know yet.
Shehab, is there any advantage for Kemi Badenoch in the fact that ideologically her opposition is a lot closer to the American government than the British government is?
I think there is some. I think she will be feeling encouraged by the result over in the United States. She will have seen the way in which Trump has campaigned and why it has been successful. Often the political theory is what happens in the US, often the UK follows and vice versa. And she will look and take inspiration from Donald Trump, especially if, as time goes on, if the Starmer-Trump relationship doesn't blossom in the way that the government wants it to. The other thing we've seen with Donald Trump is he is happy to engage with politicians in the United Kingdom who aren't in government. We've seen his relationship with Nigel Farage. He is happy to engage with Nigel Farage, even though Nigel Farage isn't in Downing Street. And look, there is that potentially presents an opportunity for Kemi Badenoch. She will be able to look at that and say, hold on, if we have ideological similarities, which they do, if she is able to forge a relationship through the statements that she makes, if she goes over to the US, if they're able to converse in a similar sort of way to the way Nigel Farage did, she may be able to form a relationship separate to the one that Keir Starmer will forge. So it's going to be quite an interesting balance to strike as time goes on. The other key thing, and Carl has already said this, but Donald Trump, the campaigner, could very potentially be very different from Donald Trump, the president. He often talks about negotiating. He often talks about the strategy, the art of the deal, as he often says. And the fact that he's saying that he's going to resolve the war in Ukraine on day one may just be a negotiating tactic. He may go in and use that to do something else. So we don't know for sure exactly what the ramifications of a US presidency under Donald Trump this time round will look like, because he will be presented with a lot of challenges on his plate. And Keir Starmer will have to react adequately to deal with that and ensure that the relationship builds, because a relationship with the US is crucial for his time as Prime Minister.
That's really interesting. I just want to touch quickly before we finish on 2 points on Kemi Badenoch. It was only touched on briefly by Ed Davey during the session, but her heritage. Carl, you and I have grown up with a political establishment in which black faces are relatively rarely seen. Today, we've seen a black person right at the centre of the political establishment. That does feel like an enormous moment. And also, just on a personal level with Kemi Badenoch, we said at the start, how much she appeared to be enjoying herself. There was one very telling moment, I thought, where she raised a glass of water to her lips and you could see her hand was shaking. We shouldn't underestimate, should we, both of you, what an enormous test PMQs is for a new party leader.
Yeah, that's right. It is a big moment. Although we are seeing her at the dispatch box, or many people are seeing her at the dispatch box for the first time, of course, she has been at the dispatch box before, both, mainly as a minister, actually. She has performed in Parliament many times, but she will have known that this was a big moment for her with a lot of eyes watching her. And of course, there will have been some nerves in the background. As far as her heritage is concerned, look, it is a curious feature of British politics that the Conservative Party has done much, much better at having a diversity of backgrounds in its leadership than the Labour Party, which would consider itself the more progressive party. And I think some people in Labour, and we've seen that from tweets, some of which Keir Starmer was asked about today, there are some in the Labour Party who find that very difficult to accept.
Shehab?
Irrespective of where you stand politically, it is a significant moment that a black woman is now leading one of the UK parties in Westminster. It's another glass ceiling that has been broken. But as Carl says, the Conservative Party have a history now, especially in the last few years, of having very diverse leaders, having diverse politicians in the most significant and senior position in the greatest offices of state, whether it's the Foreign Office, whether it's the Treasury, whether it's the Home Office. They have regularly had ethnic minorities in those positions, but irrespective, it is a significant moment, and there'll be people watching at home who will see that and be inspired to enter politics, regardless of where they stand on the political spectrum, and that is a significant thing, regardless of what you believe in.
And I think where that, sorry to interrupt, where that could have a real life effect is if voters start to follow that more and more. I mean, traditionally, many ethnic minority voters have supported the Labour Party because back in the bad old days, it was the Labour Party who stood up for them more when there was a lot of racism around. But if there are more people from black and Asian backgrounds in leadership positions in the Conservative Party and representing not only what people from ethnic minorities look like, but also their interests. A lot of small business owners and so on. I think that the history that the Labour Party has amongst some communities may start to count for less, and the Conservative Party will certainly be hoping that they can attract many more voters from those communities to their way.
That is all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us, whether you were watching or listening. Tom will be back next week, but don't forget, you can catch him on Talking Politics USA. You can find new episodes on your favourite podcast platform.